Thanks, Doris Kolesch, for this friendly introduction. And thank you very much to Jael Lehmann for inviting me to this participate in this exciting event. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. So you already see the first image of my presentation, which is taken at the protests in Vienna in 2009. After the Bologna Declaration was signed in 1999 by the education ministers of 29 European countries, in a move towards European integration, changes were gradually implemented in the structure and curriculum of higher education, as well as in the administration of universities and art schools. The new study program presented by the Bologna Accords aimed to create a European higher education area by 2010, including a reform based on the Anglo-American model. It was initiated to, I'm quoting now the Accords, it was initiated to improve transparency between higher education systems, as well as implement tools to facilitate recognition of degrees and academic qualifications, mobility and exchanges between institutions within the EU and beyond. This was to be realized through comparable degrees organized in a three-cycle structure, the bachelor, master, doctorate, and quality assurance in accordance with the standards and guidelines for quality assurance in the European higher education area, the ESG. The realization of the Bologna process created an enormous bureaucratic entity, and the reformed higher education system has been criticized for being too similar to schoolwork, putting too much pressure on students who, instead of having the freedom to elect subjects, have to fulfill standardized study plans and accumulate credit points, and for establishing a questionable assessment structure that is directed at objectifying efficiency instead of fostering free thinking. Furthermore, high tuition fees led to what Felicity-On calls cultural apartheid, referring to the situation of purchasing higher education individually at source, rather than socially through tax, which reinforces the social distinction and exclusions of those studying and, by extension, producing art, exponentially segregating class through cultural division. This development also generated the bureaucratization of artistic research. I'm showing a few images of the process. Artistic research is becoming a fetish for grant applications, and as Irit Rogov put it, it forms part of an ever-increasing bureaucratic control of education in the EU. Rogov is one of the many academics who regard the Bologna process as a threat, and her concept of potentiality of the academy as a space for experimental thinking and open-ended process was directed against the utilitarian approach of the bureaucratic Bologna system. Although there are differences within the EU, in Germany, for example, art schools can still choose whether to implement the Bologna structure or not. I think Hamburg is the only school at the moment who completely, Kiel as well, okay, completely took it over. The general tendency is clear, and the development I just described has become the standard for higher education in the EU. But protests did produce results. In Austria, for example, where most of the images are taken from, some from German protests, most of the images are from Vienna. In Austria, for example, student protests prevented the Bologna structure from being implemented at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna. In Great Britain, on the other hand, nobody took to the streets, and the universities ended up being hit the hardest by the neoliberal redeployments. Thatcherism made people give up on the idea of self-empowerment, apparently. One could say that the encroachment of economic logic into all areas of life now also included the corporatization of academies. With the expanding art market and increasing corporatization of art institutions, art academies have long been the last bastion of free learning and experimentation in the art field, at least outside the Anglo-American system. Therefore, it's quite obvious that this normalization of neoliberal ideology, what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, is the main target when artists and curators deal with education in their practice today. I will now introduce a few different approaches, methods, and projects. First, art institutions take over the functions of free learning spaces. While universities, and to a large extent also art academies, are losing their mandate to offer a space for free learning, non-utilitarian research, and risky thinking, some contemporary art institutions are taking over the function of free learning spaces. At the beginning of the new millennium, around the same time as universities were starting to implement the Bologna system, curators, often in close collaboration with artists, began developing new methods to change art institutions from within. These approaches were labeled new institutionalism and were based on a self-reflexive critique of institutional organization and on curatorial action aimed at jettisoning the functions and organizational forms of the traditional modernist exhibiting institution, as well as the market and image-orientated exigencies of museums that had corporatized in the context of neoliberal social developments. The institution was going to become a flatly hierarchical, interactive, and versatile production site at all levels, which should produce a public rather than reach an audience, integrate the process of artistic production into institutional activities through residencies, workshops, and studio space, initiate a discourse at various levels rather than reactively depict and comment on what is happening outside in the world. And the viewer should be relieved of his or her passivity and become an active participant in a creative and discursive process. Frequently cited examples of new institutions in this sense are the Roseum in Malmö under Charles Escher, the Munich Kunstverein, that was 2000-2005, the Munich Kunstverein with Maria Lind, 2001-2004, Palais de Tokyo, Paris, Nicolas Bourriot and Jérôme Sens, 1999-2006, Platform Garantie in Istanbul, Vasif Khotun, 2001-2010, Magba Barcelona, Manuel Bojaviel, 1998-2007, BAC Utrecht, Maria Larayova since 2000, and the United Nations Plaza in Berlin, Anton Vidocq and Julieta Aranda, 2006-2007. As this incomplete list shows, new institutionalism is a European phenomenon that has developed chiefly in the countries of Western and Northern Europe since the end of the 1990s. This led to the emergence of new alliances between artists and curators. Education played an important role in these approaches as seminars, academic readers, conferences, and film programs became an integral part of institutional programming, if not the main and only part, as for example in the United Nations Plaza. Although film programs as such, for example, are in no way new, it is the emphasis that is placed upon these educational events within the overall program and their sweeping success in recent years that have broken through the thick hide of the exhibition-fixated function of art institutions. This is not only reflected in the fact that these art institutions have become participants in academic debates and thus unshackling these academic debates from academia and making them accessible to a broader public. Theme-oriented readers that are of value for research are increasingly being published by art institutions. Previously, that was only done by the Dia Art Foundation with its discussions in contemporary culture from 1992 to 1997, a series of readers. Parallel to the subjects of its in-house exhibitions and symposia, for instance, the BAC in Utrecht regularly publishes readers such as Concerning War or On Knowledge Production. These were like two famous titles in the series. Since 2006, the Whitechapel Gallery has collaborated in bringing out the Documents of Contemporary Art series, together with MIT Press. And the Bergen Kunsthal, with its biannual reader and preceding conference, have also further debate on critical developments in their respective fields. Interdisciplinary activities, such as the above-mentioned seminars, symposia, film programs, and workshops, are now offered as a matter of course, not only by the smaller art spaces, but also by the big exhibition halls and museums. On a project basis, the Project Academy, spelled in capital letters, which ran from 2005 to 2006, and was a collaborative initiative involving the Kunstverein in Hamburg, MUCA in Antwerp, Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, and the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths College in London, made this process of how art institutions could deal with education explicit. Based on collaboration and exchange, the project, which consisted of group exhibitions, workshops, symposia, and seminars in the respective institutions, merged the activities of curators, theorists, and artists in reflecting educational methods related to the practice of art institutions. In her text that I mentioned before, Academy as Potentiality, published in the book to accompany this project, Irit Rogroff from the Department of, or representing the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths within that project, defends the museum as the space of unexpected learning against the assumed efficiency of education and the marketability of research that are imposed on art academies by the Bologna Accords. Second, art projects and art spaces with an educational imperative. Besides the transformation of existing art institutions, efforts have been made by curators and/or artists to establish alternative educational platforms beyond any institutional attachments. An early example in Europe of a school set up by curators is the Institut des Hautes Études en Art Plastique, IHIP, which was active from 1988 to 1995 as an alternative to the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The institute was an experimental school for artists and was directed by the curator Pontus Hultén, in collaboration with the permanent professors Serge Fauchereau, Daniel Burel, and Sarkis. Maybe it's important to mention that it was a governmental initiative standing behind that, and the institute was covered by money coming from the government. The institute was an experimental school for artists and was directed, I said that. The diverse figures provided the nexus of artistic and curatorial tuition and managed to bring in speakers such as Pierre Bourdieu, Renzo Piano, Jean-François Lyotard, Niki de Saint-Phal, Jean Nouvel, Janis Cornelis, Hans Hake, Michael Asher, Dan Graham, Lawrence Wiener, Harald Seemann, Giuseppe Panza di Piumo, and so on, as well as a number of scientists and mathematicians. The small groups of 20 students per year were involved in intense day-long teaching sessions with the tutors. There's a contemporary version of the IHIP funded in 2012, but at this point I only want to refer to the original implementation. In the spirit of the Black Mountain College or Michael Asher's legendary post-studio class at CalArts, the practices developed within IHIP were not much different from those of other art schools. But the proposed experience it offered was innovative in that it encouraged interdisciplinary exchange and lengthy discussions. While in the 1980s, the aim of alternative educational programs was still to free education from disciplinary teaching methods and to foster non-hierarchical exchange, the political agenda of current alternative educational platforms is mainly directed against the neoliberal, efficiency and result-oriented education system and the selection of students in combination with high tuition fees, which privileges students from richer families and as a consequence provides the basis for art to become a very upper and upper middle class pursuit. As a current example of schools initiated by curators, I want to refer to the Open School East in London. That's the building. The Open School East opened in 2013, founded by the curators Anna Collin, Lawrence Taylor, and Sam Thorne from Freie, as a non-accredited study program. The school provides 13 associates with free workspaces for the course of one academic year, as well as free tuition by international artists, writers, curators, and theorists such as Tate Modern curator Catherine Wood, Maria Lind, the director of Tinsta in Stockholm, and artists Pablo Bronstein and Ed Atkins. Demand for places is high, and in lieu of paying fees, students donate 1 day a month for public activities in and around the school, which is housed in the Rose Lipman Library in Hackney, one of London's poorer boroughs. As part of the specific profile of the OSE, the project is set up to facilitate the sharing of knowledge and skills between artists, local residents, and community organizations. The personal practice of the participants might become a community project, says Anna Collin, or they might give lessons such as dance or furniture design to local people. So in a sense, there is a specific and community-based bias to this project. The old library building is set to become a creative community hub after being transformed into a free-to-attend art school. That was the group in front of the building. The next 4 images are all taken in mid-March 2014 at PAF, the Performing Arts Forum, for a 3-day retreat the group took there. There were 2 practitioners invited to run a series of activities. Esther Salmona, writer working with sound and landscape, and Guillaume Fayard, who is a poet and translator. That final image is taken in Felixstowe together with Mark Fisher, who was a tutor for 1 day, in the display about containerization in the cafe of the container port in Felixstowe. An opposite definition of the OSE was provided by Angus Cameron, who is a lecturer at the University of Leicester. He said that Open School East was immediately appealing because it deliberately sets out to break the rules. It is an art school that is not an art school because it has little or no institutional structure, no formal accreditation, and few, if any, full-time staff. Students in England are usually £30,000 in debt when they leave university or art school. While the Institute IHEP was forced to close when it ran out of funding after 7 years, and current projects like the Open School East, which is backed by around £110,000 from the Barbican and Create London, they're also operating on a short-term basis with an uncertain future. Schools by artists. Examples of artist-initiated art educational platforms include Jakob Jakobsen and Henriette Heise's Copenhagen University that ran from 2001 till 2007. It was a self-institution, as they called it, self-institution that involves collectively organized, loosely scheduled series of workshops, meetings and lectures in their private home in Copenhagen, accompanied by a library and an archive, with the aim of privileging collaborative processes and non-hierarchical learning in a private environment. Another example I could mention is Tania Bruguera's long-term project, Behavior Art School Cátedra Arte de Conducta, which ran from 2002 to 2009 in Havana, Cuba. It was a pedagogical model that makes up for the lack of civic discussion spaces on the function of art in present Cuban society and promoted new generations of artists and intellectuals. Then there is Pablo Helguera's The School of Pan-American Unrest, 2006 till 2007, which consisted of a traveling schoolhouse that made 30 stops between Anchorage and Terra del Fuego. Through discussions in public workshops, performances, screenings, and collaborations between individuals and more than 30 collaborating organizations, the SPU sought to generate connections between the different regions of the Americas beyond their regular commercial and economic links. I would now like to look more closely at one example, which is Ahmet Ögüt's The Silent University, which is organized as a knowledge exchange platform by and for refugees and asylum seekers. The project was founded in 2012 in London in collaboration with Tate and Delfina Foundation and is currently operating at Tensta Konsthall in Stockholm. Tensta is a district of Stockholm, a large, late modernist housing scheme that was built in the late 1960s and has approximately 20,000 inhabitants. So Stockholm is a very segregated city. The more central parts of Stockholm are completely white Swedish middle class, and all the suburbs are with Tensta like 90% up to almost 100% immigrant population, and also the immigrants are segregated. So there are the Russians, there are the Arabs, there are Turkish people. So it's a very segregated city, unlike other Swedish cities, Malmö, for example, where it's more mixed even in the city center. The declaration of the TSU states, the university recruits asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants with a professional background in their countries of origin, which, due to systemical social exclusion and processes of discrimination, are unable to put their knowledge to professional use in the countries which they currently live in. So as everybody knows, a pharmacist from Syria coming to Germany as a refugee has to work as a cleaning person. Through the silent university, careers that have been muted in that way are included and reassigned. Taking the form of an academic program, classes, lectures, libraries, seminars, a website, and student cards are created. The long-term goal is that these project-based collaborations will create lasting commitments, as the silent university aims to be more than a project. I have a few images now from meetings. The first one was the logo of the silent university. That's a group meeting at Tensta Konsthall in May 2014. This is a lecture by Rebwa Fakhri, and the title of the lecture was 1951 Convention on the Legal Status of Refugees. The lecture was at the ABF Center in Stockholm, 2013. That's a lecture by, okay, a little gymnastics in the morning. That's a lecture by XA with the title East Turkestan's Education Systems, also at ABF in Stockholm. So gymnastics into the other direction. That's a group meeting at lecturer Fahima Anabilsis' house in Tensta in May 2013. Finally, that's in the right position. That's a workshop held by Ahmet Ögüt himself on the define and use of silent university student ID cards. That's at the former West Congress in Berlin. That's a Skype meeting at Tensta Konsthall with a Silent University London group. So there is an exchange between the local working groups as well. So Silent University started in London. Now the current implementation is in Stockholm. There is still a continuation of collaborations with the former group. That's the Silent University Resource Room at Tensta Konsthall. It was taken in November 2013. I also used that resource room for my researches for this lecture. It includes a lot of independent publications on educational topics, but also like books by Ivan Illich, Paulo Freire. So like standard literature on education, but also independent publications as well. And the final one is a lecture by Shakro Yahani on Herodotus and the Civilization of Medes. That was taken at the Silent University International Conference in Berlin last year in November. By targeting the interests and needs of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, the position of TSU can be seen in relation to current developments in the EU, to the Frontex regulation, and also to the fact that since 2011, non-EU students are required to pay registration and tuition fees for studies at higher education, for example, in Sweden and in other countries. For countries with no general tuition fees, again like Sweden, this means that there are two classes of students emerging. Those from EU countries who don't have to pay tuition fees, and those from outside the EU who have to pay more. In Sweden, it's currently more than 10,000 euro per year. The name Silent University can be seen as a comment on the pressure of communicating in a managerial working environment, as it emphasizes the importance of listening and nonverbal communication when you don't speak the same language, for example. The Silent University's aim is to challenge the idea of silence as a passive state, which Paulo Freire has been analyzing in his seminal book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and explore its powerful potential through performance, writing, and group reflection. These explorations attempt to make apparent the systemic failure and the loss of skills and knowledge experienced through the silencing process of people seeking asylum. Over a one-year period, Ahmet Ögüt came to Stockholm regularly to meet the people he subsequently collaborated with, the group of lecturers and consultants, as well as partner organizations such as the ABF, the Educational Organization for Workers, where some of the lectures took place that we just see. At Tensta Konsthall, there is a resource room that was installed as part of the exhibition, we also just seen, as part of the exhibition Tensta Museum, which is a group exhibition. It's an open archive that houses contributions by artists, researchers, educators, and community organizations in the form of essays, publications, films, and references. The resource room serves as a platform to highlight the broader themes, can go back to that image again, to highlight the broader themes and concerns of the Silent University, which are silence, alternative platforms for learning, alternative economies, and migration. So these are the four main topics the Silent University is circulating around. The ideal scenario is that the project becomes more and more self-organized by its members, working against the typical project form and always thinking long-term. While attendance is free, all the participants are paid for each lecture they hold, making it a voluntary project through which they can again professionalize their knowledge and teaching skills. What is different about Ögüt's Silent University and the other approaches I outlined in comparison to previous examples of educational processes organized by artists is that here pedagogical forms inform the artistic practice itself. As Kristina Lee-Podevska points out, the Black Mountain College, like the Russian constructivists and the Bauhaus before it, sought to erode the distinction between art and life through educational vehicles, but in contrast to current approaches, they did not appropriate pedagogical forms in their artistic production, using them instead as a means to an end. So maybe the lecture performances that Gabriele Brandstätter mentioned by Buckminster Fuller are an exception or one of the approaches trying to go beyond this barrier or to break this barrier between pedagogical forms and artistic forms. Meaning that while they were experimenting with innovative experience and discussions created pedagogical methods, the art of the Black Mountain artists was not so different to the art produced in regular art schools. Therefore, the innovative ideas on pedagogy were not seen as artistic, but strictly separated from their artistic output. Therefore, looking for predecessors to current pedagogical initiatives by artists, one would rather mention Joseph Beuys at Freie International University, who could be seen as the first example to present scores of educational lectures as performances documented in a series of photographs and blackboard drawings that register the artist's actions. In relation to this argument, it's also relevant to consider those current approaches that don't necessarily take the form of a school or even establish a participatory process of learning, but take education as a motive to be examined and analyzed. Due to the limited time available here, I will only present one example, which is the work of the British artist Olivia Plender. Plender explores the idea of learning through play and examines changing attitudes to education and value in the contemporary knowledge economy. Many of her projects explore different educational models, ranging from mainstream examples such as world fairs and television, to the structures and systems of knowledge production proposed by fringe social and religious movements. These include modern spiritualism and the Kibbutz Kift Kindred, a British youth movement that existed between 1920 and 1951. Olivia Plender's piece Social Construction, which you see here in the image from 2012, is based on a 19th century model developed by the German educational reformer Friedrich Fröbel. Participants are invited to assemble one of 31 building options from the wooden blocks and instructions supplied. Fröbel, who created the concept of the kindergarten on the basis of innovative pedagogical principles, advocated free play in childhood and to this end gave children a series of gifts. These gifts were mainly toys that were meant to encourage different stages of child development, whilst being open enough in form that children's creativity would be engaged. Unlike Fröbel's version of the building blocks, which are the sixth gift, in Plender's piece, the posters, which you see here in the image, the posters outline various building options that represent institutional structures. These include a church, a school, a military academy, and even some kind of cultural institution where we see three musicians about to enter. In this way, Plender puts Fröbel's building blocks, which were meant to foster creativity and free play, in the context of actual existing institutional control and disciplinary schooling systems. Plender reveals the obstacles to progressive and radical pedagogy, which lie in the unequal relationship to powerful institutions. Now my final paragraph. What's the political potential of educational activities in the art field? Based on the assumption that education can be used as a tool for remodeling society, the practices I introduced are not only developing countermodels to existing institutionalized education, but are targeting the larger questions of political nuisances: migration politics, managerialism and bureaucracy, class distinction, and inequality fostered by globalized economies. They offer instead free and open access, inclusion, playfulness, autocracy, dialogical experience, transnational ties and relations beyond economic interests, and local community-related commitments. These values reflect an image of an equal and free society, the égalité Etienne Balibar demands in his latest book, and appeal to the politics of education. The pedagogical methods often reference the radical pedagogy of Paulo Freire, and some artists and curators refer explicitly to his seminal book Pedagogy of the Oppressed from 1970, or his essay Education and Community Involvement. Freire sees praxis as a balance of reflection and action, as a process associated with struggle, liberation, solidarity, dialogue, and transformation on both a macro level, post-colonial struggle, and a micro level, a single word. It is remarkable that Freire's initial position, which was a critique of the oppressive relationships created by colonialism, is today related to the oppressive relationships created by neoliberal capitalism. Indeed, a number of similarities between colonial oppression and the oppression created by the neoliberal system can be observed, not only in increasing gaps between rich and poor within most societies as well as on a global level, and in the increasing gap in access to privileges, but also in relation to the circumstances in a return to the banking model of education. The banking model projects the pupil as an empty vessel that has to be filled with canonized knowledge by the teacher. This model, which Freire condemned as a control mechanism over a subject who is rendered passive, is now returning as part of the standardized curricula of the Bologna Accord. The high tuition fees and the imposed efficiency of tertiary education. The disengagement of the relationship between social class and knowledge that Freire sought is therefore still a central demand. The question is now, how can these ideas, shaped within small-scale initiatives in the art field, inform the official educational system and thereby create a bigger political impact? The small-scale initiatives presented here have all chosen names that reflect the official educational system. Indeed, they make an important claim by calling themselves a university or a school. The accusation that most of the educational projects initiated by artists and curators just seem to be workshops, as Mick Finch, who leads the BA Fine Arts course at Central St. Martin, said in an interview, is dismissive. While it's correct that duration and continuity are not always assured in most of the projects, mainly due to economic limitations, as they are usually financed from an institution's exhibition budget, and they do not lead to an official degree qualification, it is precisely this playful claim to an official status which indicates their objective of producing sustainable effects and creating the new normal. In this respect, it is essential to address those institutions which host or facilitate pedagogic approaches initiated by artists and curators. As Ahmed Özgür points out, only when individuals leading such institutions challenge bureaucratic and administrative structures by changing the politics with creative strategies rather than bringing in artists and cultural practitioners for temporary collaborations, can we arrive at a truly successful pedagogic practice. Concrete results will only arrive when policymakers, artists, cultural practitioners, and institutions all come together in genuine and sustained collaboration. End of Ahmed Özgür's quote. Viewed in this light, the methods I mentioned earlier that were labeled new institutionalism played a crucial role by paving the way or offering models of how art institutions can expand their educational programs with lectures, publications, and academic conferences that examine the influence of neoliberal ideology on all parts of life. In this way, they introduced academic discourses to a broader public. Many of these approaches were, however, unable to withstand the cultural and political headwind in the last decade and have therefore returned to, well, normal. So most of the institutions I mentioned in the beginning that were labeled as new institutions changed radically. Either they were closed down or they were restructured. Like, for example, the Museum in Malmö is now a branch of the Moderna Museet in Stockholm. It remains to be seen whether the situation has changed in the meantime, since the 99% identified themselves as the vast majority, which might have been the most urgent claim and perhaps the only lasting political effect of the Occupy movement. Mark Fisher's book Capitalist Realism, which I mentioned earlier, is subtitled, "Is There No Alternative?" These educational projects in the art field, initiated by artists and curators, are trying to suggest exactly those alternative models, which according to a value-preserving neoliberal agenda don't exist. It is remarkable that when Fisher analyzes and laments the implementation of neoliberal values in every area of society, his line of argument is also closely related to the changes in the academic sector. The above-mentioned artistic and curatorial projects are confronting precisely this process of normalization, the imposition of the neoliberal value system upon our lives, and are instead asking, how can we create the new normal? How can we, for example, discuss the value of our jobs in the art field and the quality of art beyond the logic of the market and the utilization within the bureaucratic logic of the academic sector? As such, they are not only suggesting progressive pedagogy, which can actually already be found in niches within the official educational system, they are also imagining a future beyond the neoliberal dictum of upholding the status quo as the only livable system. The most compelling pedagogic models developed within the framework of artistic and curatorial projects are therefore introducing ideas on how to create a new normal from below, how to define learning beyond competition and efficiency, and its method beyond managerialism and bureaucracy. Thank you very much.